So I just want to make a few comments before I get going. One of the nice things about being third is that you can listen to the people who spoke before you and you kind of orient yourself to what's going on. And first off, I'd like to say I agree with Dan that we need an alternative management model. I think we have an alternative management model. Dan pointed to Toyota. We've been pointing to Toyota for 20 years or so. They do things differently. It's not that Toyota is a fantastic company, but they're different. And so it's an interesting research subject, which I think is the same. Dan and I are attracted to the company for the very same reasons. We are running, I think, into a head-on collision with, I don't know, call it brain science or neuroscience or the changing world of education, pedagogy, that kind of thing. So this alternative management model, I just want to write down, tell you these notes I wrote down here as I was listening. We can talk about the alternative management model. We can describe it. We can prove that it's better. We can show examples, but none of that is going to lead to its adoption or to change. People don't behave a certain way because they lack information. We behave a certain one way or another because we are in a groove, because our neurons have practiced that groove for a while, and that's our way of behaving. Hoping to create different behavior by trying to persuade people to see the errors of their ways doesn't work. We know that now. This is a bitter pill, actually, for education, because education puts kids in a classroom for an hour. We noticed the other day at the University of Michigan on North Campus, it's the technical campus, that our tables are bolted to the floor. We can't even put people into teams and have them do experiential learning. The concept from the get-go when the building was built was the tables are in a row, they're bolted down, you're all sitting there, I'm going to deliver the lecture, and that's how we learn and that's how we change. The collision we're running into, of course, is that that's not how we learn and that's not how we change. It's much more experiential. What does work is deliberately practicing a different routine, which over time changes how you think, okay? But the fly in the ointment, can one say that? The problem with that is if you want to deliberately practice a routine, you have to have a routine to practice. There has to be something specific that you can practice. In the United States, we have baseball, and it's one of our great pleasures to take our German guests to a baseball game because it's a very slow-moving game compared to soccer, and it's 3 hours long, right? So it's really kind of a Schadenfreude. But if you said to the pitcher in baseball, as way of training, throw it over the plate, it's not going to work. You have to show the person how to throw. You have to observe how they're throwing. You have to have a technique that they can practice over and over again so that it becomes their groove, their mental groove for a different way of behaving and a different way of thinking. We have such a thing, and I'm calling it a kata. Toyota Kata Mindset is the name of my talk. Very much in line with policy deployment, align your teams, get better at achieving goals and meeting challenges. As you can see in the drawing here, in the book, I did this drawing where we have a current condition and our next target condition, and you can see the individual working iteratively along this staircase, experimenting, Dan, to use your language, along the way. It was a vice president of manufacturing who added these other people climbing this staircase, and he said, Mike, this Toyota Kata idea has changed my job, or my picture of my job as a manager. Before, people would come to me with problems, and I thought my job as a manager was to solve those problems. I need to have the answers. And he says, now I see my job as developing, just as the speakers before me said, developing the capability of these people to work systematically and scientifically toward an objective. And if I can get them to do that, then I can introduce challenges into the organization and they can handle the challenges. My job is to develop that capability. And I think he did a nice improvement of the picture that I have in the Toyota Kata book with all the people here. But so what I'd like to focus on today, Dan and I were talking last night, and one thing I remain convinced that the visible aspects of lean, the lean solutions, tools, techniques, and principles to improve quality, cost, and delivery are as important as ever. Every time we try to make an improvement, I'm reminded of how important it is to have some fundamental lean knowledge. Otherwise, you'll have teams saying, oh, we don't have a one-piece flow here. This person has a little extra work. Let's buffer that, right? Which, of course, is not a lean concept. Keep out-of-cycle work in the line instead of moving it out of the line. There are dozens of lean concepts that are very important. But what I want to talk about is the less visible part of lean, which you might describe as a systematic, scientific, there's Dan's word, a systematic scientific routine of thinking and acting, and number 2, middle managers as teachers of that routine. And I'd like to propose that what I'm going to talk about here today is something that middle managers should spend more of their time on. But before we get going, let's start with this familiar illusion. How many people know this illusion? Can I just see a show of hands? Yeah, it's not everybody. Okay, could someone who knows what this is about explain it to the rest of the group, since not everybody raised their hand? Just anybody. Tell us what's going on here in this illusion. And speak up a little bit because you don't have a microphone. Yeah, go right ahead.
Yes, I'm not sure about why this illusion happens, but the bigger one and the vertical, they seem to be different sizes. On the right seems to be bigger, but in reality it isn't. They have the same size.
Okay, because of the presentation, the familiar illusion is that the two lines are the same length, but the one on the right-hand side looks longer. Thank you very much. Actually, the one on the right is longer. I made it longer. But I don't want you to, let me ask my Japanese colleague to confirm. We have the diagram here, and we have a ruler. Would you please, it should be 1/8 of an inch longer on the right-hand side there. He and I travel together. Sometimes I'm the patsy, and he's up here. Today it was his turn. You know. Is it longer? Just a little bit, 1/8 of an inch. It's longer. Okay, great. What I want to point out with this is that once we think we know, we stop experimenting. Once we think we know where to go, once we think we know the answer, we don't look left or right, we don't try things out, we just charge ahead. So here's another familiar illusion. The visible part of lean. Here are books about how Kanban works. We've even contributed to that body of knowledge ourselves. We may know how a Kanban system works, and that's important and necessary knowledge. But the less visible piece is, I have no idea what's going to make your Kanban system work. And that's going to be completely different from what makes your Kanban system work. And you're going to face completely different obstacles introducing your Kanban system. So the question is, which of these is the lean community teaching, and what mindset is the lean community creating? If we go into the world saying, yes, we know how Kanban works, it's something that we have to implement, we don't experiment. Then it becomes an implementation project. We put people's names on the list, everybody has their action items, and I think you're probably familiar with the situation where in the end, the supervisor, of course, still has the schedule in his or her pocket, but there is this ostensible Kanban system in place, but it's not really working, right? I want to talk more about this piece of, we don't know. We like to be certain in our view, okay? We really do prefer to be certain. And it's not because we're bad, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit more today, but it's because that's the way our brain is wired, all right? And you're going to hear an engineer talking about brain science today, so I'd like to urge you to be careful. Put an asterisk next to everything I say. Remember, engineer talking about brain, there's something wrong here. So once we think we know, we set a course and go rather than testing, learning, and adapting, and that's where the trouble begins. It wasn't hard to find a picture on the internet of where human beings have thought one thing and another thing happened. There were lots of pictures of Jeeps in water up to the windows. I thought this one was particularly good. So, we drive in, we think it's 6 inches deep, and it's, 4 feet deep. Here's an interesting quote from a book that some of you may have read, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. The book's a bit tedious, but there are a lot of interesting points in it. For example, declarations of high confidence mainly tell you that an individual has constructed a coherent story in his mind, not necessarily that the story is true. So yes, I know what makes Kanban work. I've got a certainty in my mind. My mind can cruise a little bit because now it's not having to stress itself and use more energy. But in fact, that's where the trouble begins. So here's a word. What is metacognition? This is a word I was unfamiliar with not too long ago. What is metacognition? Kind of big word. Anybody? What does that mean? What is metacognition? Well, it means, it's very simple. I don't know why they use such a big word. It means thinking about how you think, all right? And it's a particular capability that human beings have over most of the other animals on the planet. I don't think the cow is standing in the field thinking, I could have done that a little bit better yesterday. Maybe I could improve my style. There are some primates, apparently, that do have self-consciousness, and this is a sidebar note, but it's kind of interesting. I'm always impressed with how scientists come up with experiments. How do you find out if a primate, not human, has self-consciousness? They give them a hand mirror. And so some animals, you'll give them a mirror, and the animal will paw at the mirror. But some of the primates will very quickly begin to touch their own face, realizing that they're seeing themselves in the mirror, leading the researchers to believe that there is some sense of self-consciousness there. But I think, unless you read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and you know it's the white mice running the show, I think we are on the top of the heap with our prefrontal cortex in our ability to think about how we think and to be deliberate about how we think and to be deliberate in what we practice to change how we think. So let's do a quick experiment. Nothing earth-shaking or new here. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Everyone, just please cross your arms. Oh, I can look here. That's nice. And now, of course, cross them the other way. You'd think I'd be getting better at this. All right, thank you. And let's do the same thing with clasping this. So clasp your hands in front of you. And now clasp them the other way. Okay, good. Yeah, exactly. So in each case, how did it feel the second time compared to the first? What kind of words come to mind? Uncomfortable, awkward, unnatural. You have to think. That's right. I think that's right. You have to be deliberate about it. Correct. I agree. There are many words that describe it. So for most of us, the other way, the second way, feels odd. We have to be conscious about it and more deliberate. So what's going on, apparently, and here you have an engineer talking about the brain. I have to warn you repeatedly. Our unconscious habits are fast and powerful. So our brain creates these habits for efficiency to free up capacity for when deliberate decision-making is necessary. Apparently, your brain is like a 3-pound meatloaf, but it uses apparently 20% of your body's energy. It's a phenomenal amount of energy that it's using. So it's constantly trying to save energy. It can't even get enough energy. So what it does is it has these habits, our subconscious thinking or unconscious thinking, enables you to get through the day by taking care of routine decisions with minimum fuss. So think about when you first learned to drive an automobile, right? Stepping on the brake, putting on the turn signal, working the steering wheel, doing the head check. All of this was very deliberate and difficult. Where did you probably practice the first time you drove a car? In a parking lot, right? Not in traffic. Because, when you have to stop, you're like, okay, it's the third 3 pedals, it's the middle one. Oh, yes, that one, right? And if you have to be that deliberate about it, like you said, I had to think about it, you're not going to be able to drive in traffic very well. Today, when you drive, do you think about where the brake pedal is? Probably not too much, right? What are you concentrating on instead? What's happening outside the windshield, the situational aspects that you do need to consciously be aware of. Where do I need to turn? What's the driver in front of me doing? What's the driver behind me doing? And so forth. So unconscious thinking is very fast and instinctive, which you noticed when you folded your arms and clasped your hands the first time. But deliberate thinking is much more slow and intentional. The subconscious is really powerful. It can process billions of bits of information per second. Don't ask me how they measure that. I have no idea. But your deliberate mind can only process a few thousand bits per second. So, our conscious is riding on this big elephant that we don't see, which is our subconscious. That elephant determines the direction. So much of what we do is habitual. It's a good thing, like crossing our arms performed almost without thinking. Habits are behaviors that have been repeated regularly and occur unconsciously. The repeated behavior develops neural pathways in the brain, making the behavior easier to complete. When we first started the research for Toyota Kata, the question was, how come Toyota gets continuous improvement from these techniques and we don't? And we were pretty sure it was in their management system. Jim and Dan were already saying it's something about their management system is different, but we didn't have a lot of information about what's different in their management system other than they asked questions. So we went to talk to Toyota executives and we asked them questions. We said, so how do you manage? How do you learn to manage that way? How do you teach others to manage that way? And by and large, they couldn't answer the question. And at first we thought there had been a memo that if you tell the University of Michigan researchers the secret sauce of the Toyota management system, you have to commit ritual suicide then and there. But then it occurred to us that actually, at least in the older Toyota, if you worked there and you were in management, middle or above, you spent your career inside Toyota. You began at Toyota and you worked your way up. And you had no other idea about managing. It had become your routine. In fact, a lot of what Toyota is doing is having you practice so that after 10 years, after you move on from being a group leader, you've internalized these patterns. And you can no longer talk about them because if I asked you what you did today, you'd say a lot of things. You went to a conference, you heard a great talk, a couple of great talks this morning, and but you wouldn't say breathing. But you probably did a lot of breathing this morning, right? Imagine if you had to be deliberate about breathing. Oh, someone forgot to breathe, quick. Could someone revive that person? So we had to change the research and try things out and experiment, and then we went back to Toyota and we said, you know, what we're seeing in terms of managerial system is a pattern that looks kind of like this, and then the Toyota guys would say, yeah, that's roughly what we do. And toward the end of the research, I came across a book about kata. I don't do martial arts. Anyone here done the martial arts? What is a kata to you in the martial arts? What do you think of? This is not a trick question this time, so if you can... Sequence of preset movements that you practice over and over again. Why do you practice them over and over again? To reach perfection, and they become a habit. So it's no good, right? When you're a beginner, you can really only do it very rigidly, just like in music and sports. We talk about how this deliberate practice idea is very common in sports and music, but not in business, interestingly enough. But, you know, if you're behind the bar at midnight and someone's coming at you, you can't say, please come at me from the left, that's the only way I've practiced, right? So you practice it so that it becomes a habit, and then you can flow with it better, right? That's exactly what Toyota's trying to do. But it's a habit, so you can't ask them about it. And then when we went and said, you know, it looks like what you're doing here is a kind of kata practice. You're repeating routines so that people internalize them. And this Toyota executive says, yeah, pretty much everything we do here at Toyota is a kata. And it was like, you know, if you'd have told us that 6 years ago, would have saved a lot of time on the research. But of course, you have to figure things out for yourself, right? So much of what happens in an organization is a consequence of the habits that people, oh, by the way, you have habits in your organization too, and if we ask your managers about daily management, they'll talk about some artifacts like the boards they use or the meetings they go to, but the actual pattern of managing will probably be invisible to them too because it's a habit. So much of what happens in an organization is a consequence of the habits that people in the organization have learned through practice. And this is kind of interesting, whether that practice is deliberate or by happenstance. You're actually practicing every day anyway. This idea of learning a habit is occurring all the time. The neuroscientists like to say every time you do something, you're more likely to do it again. Your brain is forever developing. Neuroplasticity is happening all the time. This has been sobering for me because, you know, I'm in Detroit where we are accustomed to maybe yelling at the driver in front of us who has cut us off. Turns out, according to neuroscience, you're not affecting that driver at all, but you're creating your own personality. It's very sobering, right? So every time you get mad at something, you're actually laying down tracks in your brain and creating your personality. So something to think about. Now, the habits are good because they let you get through the day with minimum fuss. You don't have to think about breathing or stepping on the brake or getting through your managerial day. The problem is the following. A pitfall of many habits is that the past experiences that created those habits do not necessarily represent future situations. And I think we do find ourselves in a different world in the last 10, 20 years. I think it's pretty evident now that we are in a different, more crowded world. Certainly in Detroit, it's obvious. When I grew up, we had 4 automakers and they shared the market amongst themselves. It's a completely different world today. And if we lose a little market share, someone else snaps it up from Korea or Germany or China or Japan, and they don't give it back. You know, they've won over our customers. It's a different situation, more dynamic, less predictable. So what would happen if you practiced folding your arms the other way every day or clasping your hands the other way every day? What would happen? Or try brushing your teeth with the other hand, with your non-dominant hand. Now, you will have bleeding gums the first few times. You think I'm kidding. How do I know this? But what would happen if you brushed your teeth with the other hand for 3 weeks, say? becomes a new normal, it becomes a habit. And there it is. There's that human capability. We just did a piece of metacognition. We can change our autopilot. Humans have the ability to deliberately develop new habits. We may think that all skill is innate. That was certainly how I grew up. You know, some people are creative, some are not. Some are skillful at this, some are not. Certainly some of it is genetic. I'm not going to be a great basketball player because I'm 5'7.5", and that half inch is important. But I can learn how to play basketball pretty well. It's not all innate. It's not that you're either born with it or not. You can rewire your thinking and habits by deliberately, i.e. consciously, practicing a targeted behavior pattern, but you do need a pattern to practice. Once the pattern you're practicing enters your unconscious, it gets smoother and faster and becomes the normal habitual way you operate. You can change the culture of an organization this way, and perhaps most interesting to me, as we were talking about last night, Dan, we can change an entire society that way. And let me just skip to the end of my talk. We face a lot of challenges, and we can meet all of them. The equipment is on board. It's at the top of the spinal column. But the capability is latent, and it requires that we manage ourselves in a slightly different way. It's a very exciting way. It's a very effective way. Dan already described it this morning when he talked about scientific thinking. We can handle all those challenges. I can't tell you how many times we've begun. I'm not a consultant, but we have to experiment, so we work with companies. And every time you begin, maybe not every time, but often, there's a person in the team sitting there like this. Maybe they're 3 years from retirement, and my boss told me to be here. I don't really want to be here. This is stupid, right? And you know, even though you don't want to judge, you do have a mental file on the person going, you're not going to get much from this person, right? And then just a few weeks later, maybe less, you're working on some obstacle between you and your next target condition along this staircase that was in the first slide, right? You're bumping up against some difficult, tough obstacle, and you come to work the next day, and you have an idea, and then that very person comes up to you and says, I was thinking about our obstacle in the shower this morning, right? You're like, really? You? And then they lay an idea on you for how to overcome that obstacle on the way to your goal that's twice as good as the one that you were going to propose to the group. And after that happens 3, 4, 5, 6 times, you realize we can handle whatever situations we have, but it does take managing ourselves in a different way. Okay, so what is a kata? Well, we've already talked about that a little bit. A kata is a routine that you practice deliberately so that its pattern becomes a habit. Just some examples here. I like the dance step ones, right? When you begin with dance steps, I'm not a dancer, but you can just about picture the mechanistic way one is practicing these steps. Of course, later, you're much more smooth on the dance floor once you've internalized it and it's moved into your fast memory, right? Another example of a kata that someone told me the other day, which I thought was really good, is if you are learning to type on a keyboard, at least in English, we type that sentence, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, right? Why do we type that sentence when we learn how to type? Uses all the letters from the alphabet, correct. So you practice that sentence over and over again, but once you acquire a certain amount of skill and reach a certain typing speed, do you still type that sentence? No, not unless you're in the movie The Shining, right? This is for the... So then you type what you want to type. You've developed the skill, you can now type a letter or whatever you want. So that was a kata. It's like a booster rocket. It's something you practice deliberately to let you acquire skill that you then apply to whatever it is you want to apply it to. So kata creates culture. In the middle of this diagram here is your team or maybe your organizational culture. That's a pretty soft subject. It's interesting the culture subject is getting much more concrete thanks to neuroscience. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But let's say your team or organizational culture, it's things like routines, habits, rituals, and norms. Every day, that culture is teaching. This is automatic, unconscious daily practicing. People come to work, they are practicing. They are laying down mental or neural pathways. And it's been fashionable to say managers should be teachers. I actually think it's incorrect. Managers are teachers. If you're a manager, if you manage people, you don't have a choice. You are teaching. By virtue of what you say and what you do, you're creating a way of thinking and a way of acting. And if that's true, doesn't it make sense to ask, what do I want to be teaching? It's really not optional. Now, there's a different kind of practicing. This is that daily, automatic, unconscious practicing, right? This is why the Toyota guys couldn't answer our question. How do you manage? How do you learn how to manage? How do you teach others how to manage, right? We got the shrugging shoulders. But there's a different kind of practice, which is deliberate practice. It's conscious, and that's where kata comes into play. So if you practice specific new behaviors, you can affect this culture. That's the idea. And we've all heard the stories about how Toyota hires. Michigan has suffered a lot of hits with the auto industry shrinking and moving to other places, although Michigan's doing fine, and Detroit is a very interesting place if you ever want to come. Large caliber is better. Just kidding. Our governor went to Japan to Toyota, the former governor, previous governor. She's a great governor, but she went to Japan, and one of her calling cards to try to bring Toyota work back to Michigan or into Michigan was that we have a workforce that is experienced in making cars. Literally, she said that. And it's funny because for Toyota, that's a negative. When we watch Toyota hire people in Georgetown and in Indiana and other places, what they look for is not your ability to build cars. They look for your ability to learn and work together with others. And basically what they say is, or what they're thinking is, we don't want you to come pre-baggaged. We're going to teach you through this process on the left. We're going to teach you our way of thinking and acting. We're going to teach you that. We want you just to be able to learn and work with others. What's interesting is that a lot of our companies select for skills. So we look out there and we try to select people who have certain skills. I think this goes a long way to explaining Toyota's remarkable consistency, at least cultural consistency, over the last 50 years, can we say? It's not that they're hiring for culture, they're developing the culture deliberately. So here's the cool thing. We now have a kata called the Improvement Kata and the Coaching Kata. We have a kata, a structured way for teaching this. We now actually have a practice routine, and it's working. So here's a definition of management, since we're talking about management today. You don't have to agree with this one. This is simply the one that we're using currently. Management as the systematic pursuit of desired conditions by utilizing human capabilities in a concerted way. Meaning, we're here, we have a current condition, and then we want to be here next. This could be a desired condition, a target condition, a challenge. And the question is, for managers, how do I get my team to navigate that territory right there? How do I get them to navigate that successfully? Sounds very familiar to the talk we heard just before. We already talked about that. So the manager actually, it's a kind of a dual role thing. Here, again, the manager is automatically teaching the prevailing culture. But with the kata, or deliberate practice kind of approach, the manager actually puts on a coach hat and begins to deliberately coach the behavior pattern to try to change the thinking and behavior in the organization. This is practice pattern number 1. Toyota does not have words for it. Toyota does not write it down. So we had to kind of ferret it out. And it looks roughly like this. It's the fundamental pattern that Toyota teaches. Understand the direction. Where are we trying to go? What's the challenge we are trying to meet? This can be anywhere from 1 to 3 years out there. This is, what are we trying to get to? Grasp the current condition, and then establish a target condition. Don't start a bunch of activity before you have a target condition. If you really want to rally a group of people, first you have to figure out where you want to go. Don't do random improvements and wastes. So this is figure out where you want to go, then it kind of shifts gears, and then they essentially iterate, or in the language of Lean, PDCA, experiment toward that target condition. If you look behind the A3, if you look behind practical problem solving, if you look behind Toyota business practices, if you look behind quality circles, you'll find this pattern. And we call it the Improvement Kata. Again, Toyota has no words for this. They have an A3, but an A3 at Toyota is a kata for teaching this way of thinking and acting. It's Toyota's kata for doing that. The Improvement Kata is about advancing towards something beyond your threshold of knowledge in a systematic, scientific way. And again, Dan, I'll refer to your earlier presentation. And practicing this pattern, practicing the Improvement Kata develops increasing mastery of improvement, adaptiveness, and innovation. That's kind of what they're about. Here's another diagram. I'm going to skip over that. Now, there's a second practice pattern. Someone's got to coach this thing, so there's a coaching kata. This is a pattern for teaching the Improvement Kata. It's essentially a set of coaching routines to practice in order to develop effective coaching habits. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Interestingly enough, there's a bit of a sticky wicket here. The manager needs to know both the Improvement Kata and the Coaching Kata. It is so popular, at least in the States right now, for managers to say, I want to be a coach. And we say, great, well, first you got to learn the Improvement Kata. No, I just want to coach the Improvement Kata. It's like saying I want to coach golf, but I've never ever had a golf club in my hand. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. So there are a few roles in practicing. I'm not going to dwell on this, and you have it in your documentation. But essentially, there's a learner. I don't know if there's a word at Toyota, maybe mentee, employee. What's that? What is it? Deshi. So we call him the learner. This person is actually applying the pattern of the Improvement Kata to some objective, to some process, to some objective. And the focus here is applying the Improvement Kata to an objective to learn the pattern of the Improvement Kata. There's a second role. Often it's the manager. This is often a reporting relationship, but it doesn't have to be. And the manager is kind of a coach or mentor, and the focus here is giving procedural guidance to develop this person's skill with the Improvement Kata. So this person doesn't give the answers, just like that VP of manufacturing said. This person ensures that this person is practicing the right procedure. What happens if you practice the wrong thing a few times? It's burned in, right? Then you have to get rid of that habit. So, and then there's also a second coach role, but I'm not going to go into that right now. So what's essentially happening is, sorry for the slightly complicated diagram. So here we have our current condition. Here's our next target condition that we're striving to reach, maybe 1 week to 3 months in the future. And it's a twisty path. We don't know exactly how we're going to get there. I don't know exactly what's going to make your Kanban system work. I know how a Kanban system works, but I don't know what we're going to run into as we traverse this territory here, right? That's what's happening here. And this is what the learner is doing. So here the learner is working on one thing. Maybe we're putting in some kinds of racks. Here we're making cards. Maybe here we're doing some cleaning and organizing. Maybe here I'm making an operator balance chart. Somewhere here I might have made a value stream map. There are all sorts of different things that are happening in here, right? Here's the coach. The coach is repeating a series of questions and coaching the person through the Improvement Kata pattern, i.e., the pattern that the coach is teaching stays the same. So the content and obstacles that the learner works on are situational and will vary. The pattern and thinking and acting, the kata, stays the same and repeats. This is the habit that the coach is actually trying to teach. And what happens is if you don't have the bottom part, I can't tell you how many times we've done this. If you say to someone, what is lean? You walk up to someone, you say, what is lean? And they say, oh, I think lean is making operator balance charts. Or I think lean is 5S. Or I think lean is Kanban. Or cellular manufacturing, because those are the things they work on. But that's not what we want. Because we don't know what's coming in the future. I can't tell you what to implement in the future because I have no idea what's coming. So the best I can teach you is this pattern. So the Improvement Kata provides the form. The focus process that you're working on provides the content. This is different than sports. In sports, training and playing are separated, generally. You don't put a trainee into the game. But at Toyota, the training is occurring on real things in real time, which is kind of elegant. In the business world, we don't have a lot of time to say, we're going to have you practice for 10 years and then we'll let you loose on something real. That's not going to be affordable. And also, you're always actually working on a real target condition to the best of your ability. So my coach might say to me, Mike is ready to stretch himself a little bit, and he'll give me an objective or lead me into an objective that matches my abilities. And the more I practice, the bigger the challenge he can give me. Think about the horsepower in the organization. If you can create that capability in the organization, and then you walk into the organization and say, now we have a really interesting challenge, a tough one. So there's been some misconceptions about Toyota-style coaching, and one of them has revolved around Socratic questioning, where the coach is supposed to ask questions, or the manager is just supposed to ask questions. What we find out in the field is that turns into managers asking questions sort of a la, I have a number in my head, please guess what the number is, right? No, that's not it, try again, right? And the learner who's down here, right, he's saying, I'm supposed to figure out what he's got in his head so that I can, have the right answer. And that's not really what's happening. What we found that is happening, and again, this is our perspective, This is an exchange of information. I'm sure we missed some things in the research and have some things wrong. I'm so certain about that I put that in the first chapter of the book. It's not all correct, but it's to the best of our knowledge. So the task that the manager is faced with is determining if their learner is operating within the corridor of improvement kata thinking and acting or outside the corridor. And then if they're outside, to introduce a course correction. And there are pedagogically a number of ways of doing that. Sometimes the coach will say, don't do that, do it this way. So actually, we saw Toyota coaches being directive once the learner had answered. Or you can let the learner fail. If it's not going to hurt anything, let the learner fail quickly, get them to do the experiment quickly. They fail, and that's a very good lesson. Sort of a la, the coach reaches into the hole, helps you back out of the hole, and says, by the way, there's a hole there. And as you're being pulled out of the hole, you go, why the heck didn't you tell me there's a hole there? And the coach would say, well, now you'll never forget that there is this hole. So this is, popular Karate Kid, right? But notice what he's doing, right? He's correcting. Why is he correcting the learner? Why? Because if he practices the wrong way for too long, what's he going to create? A habit. So he has to intervene and correct. That's what's happening here. This is Toyota-style coaching. It's not just asking questions. Now, to be able to correct, what does the coach have to have? Skill in the pattern being practiced. It's not empty coaching. So the reason the managers that we say ask questions and they want to go out and coach, the reason they say, I have a number in my head, please guess. Let me ask that in a Socratic way. The reason they do that is because they don't have the skill yet. So also to our Western eyes, what we see at Toyota looks a little bit like audit and compliance, right? That the coaching looks like a police action. I'm trying to control you. But after a long time, we saw that it's this. And Dan, this matches what Russ Scafferty and all these ex-Toyota people tell us. When they leave Toyota, they go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize what I had. He wasn't telling me what to do. He wasn't policing me. His success and my success were inextricably linked. He was trying to teach me how to play the game. He had a deep concern for me, not only as a human being, but as a team member. This coach doesn't play the game, but this coach will be evaluated on how well the game is played. So here's kind of how it works. It's a kind of a 1-2-3 pattern of teaching. And again, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but there's so much misunderstanding about coaching. The first thing that happens is the coach tries to understand how the learner is thinking. And the only way to do that is to have the learner say or do something. So the Toyota manager will say, take a look at this problem and tell me what you think. Take this blank sheet of paper and write your ideas down here. And then they do something kind of unusual. They shut up. And they just don't say anything. And then the learner comes back and says, I think we should do this, or I see the situation this way. And by doing that, the coach can then see, how is the learner thinking? And then, now it's possible to compare, is the learner here, or is the learner here, right? So the second step is to compare the learner's way of thinking and acting with the desired pattern specified by the Improvement Kata. So now the coach is in a judging mode. And then number 3, introduce a course adjustment if necessary. So now the coach is in an instructing or guiding mode. And I think this picture from music captures it perfectly. Play a few bars for me. I see you're holding the bow wrong. But the teacher would have to know how to hold the bow. And then introduce the course correction so that the practice happens so that the neurons develop this pattern. It's actually pretty simple. All right. Let's go in a little bit deeper. How have we been managing? Well, leaders and managers have tended to focus on outcomes and solutions. It's still taught today. We have a beautiful business school at the University of Michigan. I teach a class there every now and then, and this is what we're teaching, managed by results. You can see here, for example, is a solution at Toyota. This is a picture from Toyota of a triangle Kanban. Most of you might know it's a Kanban used for processes that have a longer changeover time, a batch process. And you can see here we replicated it almost perfectly in Michigan. I think we did Toyota one better. We have FIFO roller racks. So yes, score for Michigan. All right. On the other hand, Toyota has some grease pencil here that may be a little more flexible for Kaizen. I don't know. So maybe not sure yet who's the winner here. Focusing on outcomes like this is a kind of implementation orientation. And I used to think of the word implementation in a very positive way. To me, that was a positive word. Let's implement that. Today, I think of that word negatively. And it took us a long time to see it, but eventually you go, oh, kind of a Homer Simpson moment. What's happening when we have an implementation orientation? And I think what's happening unspoken in our heads is if we say, let's implement this, we are assuming unconsciously that the path to the desired condition is relatively clear. That's what we want. Let's get her done. Let's put it in place. And if that's what we're thinking, then the question here is, what is management's job? Well, then management's job would be to establish targets, maybe describe some solutions and tools, provide incentives to get it done, and then get out of the way and periodically check results, which in fact describes a lot of management behavior today. So let's take a look at, and that's called by my colleague Tom Johnson, management by results. And I'm not saying it's all bad. It works in certain situations. Let's take a look. How many of you have seen Dan Pink's TED Talk? Okay, he does this candle experiment in the TED Talk. We distilled the video down. It's available on the Toyota Kata website. You can watch the video anytime. But it's an old sociological experiment. It's been done many ways, many different ways over the years, over the decades. Here's one version of it called the candle problem. And what you get is a candle, a box of thumbtacks, a book of matches, and an assignment. And the assignment is to find a way to attach the candle to the wall so the wax will not drip on the floor. Now, just to make it interesting, we split the room in half here, and the teams on this side, let's say each table is a team. The teams on this side, if you solve this problem faster than the teams over here, you each get 20 pounds. Is there a 20-pound bill? Yeah? Okay. So that's good, right? Yeah? Okay. Dave is giving me the thumbs up. 20 pounds is good. Did you have that many bills ready? No? Oh, okay. Oh, you wanted to make money on this conference. I'm sorry. So they set the experiment up this way, right? And here's the solution. What happens is the box has kind of a dual role. It's a holder for the thumbtacks, but if you take the tacks out of the box, it becomes the candle holder. You attach the box to the wall, put the candle in it. But what happens is the teams that had the incentive take on average 3.5 minutes longer to solve this problem, which is a kind of an unexpected result, right? So now we do the experiment again, and you all have to leave because you know the answer, so we'll get 212 more people in here. And the experiment is done again with one change. The tacks are taken out of the box. So you get the same assignment, find a way to attach the candle to the wall so the wax will not drip on the floor. You get a candle, a pile of thumbtacks, an empty box, a book of matches, same deal. These teams over here, if you solve this problem faster than they do, you each get a 20-pound note, okay? And what happens in this case? In fact, the teams with the incentive solve the problem faster than the teams without the incentive. And the results over the decades have been statistically significant. They're meaningful. And what the behavioral scientists conclude from this is that extrinsic motivators and that style of managing I just described, set targets, provide incentives and tools, get out of the way and periodically check, that approach works well for tasks where the path is clear, but not for challenging problems that require creativity and adaptiveness to solve. If the path to your goal is clear, then it's just a matter of get it done. The style of managing that we are still teaching in the business school works fine for that. And I think that describes a situation earlier in the 20th century that we had, where there were many options to choose from and not as crowded and less predictable conditions. The funny thing is, when I show this to senior level people, they get kind of quiet sometimes, and they go, that's funny, because those kind of goals were, it's hard to see how we're going to get there. We have more of those now. The simple jobs are now done in Mexico and in Vietnam and China, and we have the tough jobs here. We have the challenges. So the point is, the implementation-oriented or the results-oriented management approach is not so well suited to meeting challenges, right? Here we are today. Here's where we want to get, but we can only see so far, right? Yet back here, where you see the eye, back here, this is where we make the plan, right? But a plan is like a flashlight. Let's say the flashlight only shines this far. We can only see this far into the darkness. We want to go there. How do we see further if we have this flashlight in our hand? How do we see further? take a step, right? So you take a few steps, and then, oh, there are things here we didn't know or see back here when we were making the plan, right? So if you can't see all the way, it's not implementation, it's a different style of working. I think I have time. We were looking at Toyota, and as we happened to notice that they used the ROI calculation, return on investment calculation, which was kind of a surprise to us, but it was very comforting because in Detroit, we have often been beat up for not making small cars in any significant way. Today, Detroit is making some really nice small cars. But back in the day, we didn't. And the press would often beat up on Detroit managers saying they made the bad decision, replace the managers. But it's not the managers, it's the system within which they work. So here's what happens. Someone over the last 40 years periodically said, starting with the VW Beetle arriving on our shores, said, hey, you know, the market for small cars is getting somewhat significant. We should make small cars. The finance person is wheeled in, right? And they do a quick return on investment calculation. We can't make money making small cars. So those managers made the correct decision based on their management system. We use the ROI to decide what to do. So we're at Toyota and they say, oh, we're going to ROI calculation. Really? You use ROI? And then they described it and they said, yes. The way we do it is first we decide where we have to go for the customer. Now, small cars is a bad example because Toyota's always made small cars because that's what their market demanded. But to use that example in Detroit, you'd say, well, we need to make small cars. That decision then, according to the Toyota guys, that decision is made. And then they do the ROI calculation, and if it comes out negative and say, well, you know what, we can't make money, they don't say change the direction. They say now we have to roll up our sleeves, sharpen our pencils, and find a way to do it. And then they said, you wouldn't use ROI to determine your direction because then you would be looking at your own navel and that could be very dangerous. We said, of course we wouldn't do that. No. We laughed it off, right? And went home somewhat humbled. So let's see. This one's interesting to me. In terms of developing solutions, here's a proposal, something to think about. That's all this presentation really is, something for you to think about. Maybe there are only 3 things we can and need to know with certainty. Number 1, you need to know where you are. And there's a large body of lean literature that says go and see, go to the Gemba, grasp the situation. This is very important to know where you are in as much detail as possible. Number 2, you need to know where you want to be next. Don't do random improvement. First put a stake in the ground and say that's where we're trying to go. And describe that in concrete terms. And number 3, I think the only other thing we humans are given is to know by what means we want to navigate the unclear gray zone between here and there. We have not evolved to the point where we can even see 5 minutes into the future. It'd be handy, but we haven't got it yet. Maybe someday. But what's interesting to me is that's enough for a successful, interesting life. All you got to know is where you are, where you want to be, and by what means to navigate the territory. That's all you get, but that's enough. So this is really about mobilizing, I like this word, ingenuity in an organization. Ingenuity being creating a way of doing something that we want but cannot yet do. Now take a look at this list. The challenge increases as you go down this list. So here's a challenge. An assembly operator and a team leader want to find a way to drive screws without cross-threading them. Now it's challenging because they don't have an answer yet. They have to figure it out. It's over the horizon. Now you can go down, here's one. We want to injection mold parts in lot sizes that are 50% smaller. Well, that's a little more difficult. There are several factors involved there. How about this one? We want to develop an electric car that goes 250 miles on a single charge, charges in 30 minutes, seats 5 people, goes 100 miles per hour, and does that safely. Whoa, that's a big challenge. Here's what's interesting for the researcher when you look at this. The approach you take in each one of these is the same. It's essentially the creative or scientific process that Dan talked about. The approach is the same, which it has to be because we don't know what's coming. And the other thing that's interesting is that we used to think the motivating factor, Dan, you talked about making work more, I can't remember the adjective, motivating or meaningful, thank you, make work more meaningful. We used to think that when you reach your goal, that's the moment that's meaningful. But it turns out, and there's some psychological research that backs it up, it's actually when the team is breaking through the obstacles that they have the satisfaction. It's not when you achieve the end goal, it's when you're bumping up against some obstacle between here and there, and you actually find a way as a group to overcome that obstacle. And what's interesting is it doesn't matter if you're working on cross-threading screws or the electric car. It doesn't matter. The feeling is the same. So the way of working is the same, and the feeling is the same. We've just opened the door for managers to walk through their company. I don't care what team you go to, and you can say, hey, what are you guys trying to achieve? Where are you now? What obstacles are you facing? Which one of those obstacles are you addressing right now? What's your next experiment, and how quickly can we see what we've learned from taking that experiment? And then you go over here to this team, they're working on something completely different, but the manager can say the same thing. What are you guys trying to achieve? Where are you now? Please show me. Show me the data, show me the facts. What obstacles are currently preventing you from achieving that objective? Which one obstacle are you addressing now? And what's your next experiment? And when can we see what we've learned from doing that experiment? You can ask the same 5 questions everywhere. And it's brilliant because since we can't see in the future, we need to have a meta method that's content-free. All right, so let's go in a little deeper. So where do solutions come from? This is an oversimplified line here, but stay with me for a moment. So we have at the right here business outcomes, profit and loss, market share, that kind of thing. I would like to propose that those are built on the processes, products, and services that we provide as an organization. Those, in turn, are built upon people's behavior patterns, and the behavior patterns of the people in your organization, in turn, stem from their mindset. So what is mindset? Mindset is a subconscious, habitual way of thinking and feeling that you learn over time, you pick it up over time via the successes and failures that you experience. It's a habit, just like we talked about at the beginning when we were folding arms. Some people call mindset the lens through which you view the world. You're not actually aware of your mindset, but it's the way you see and respond to things. It determines your behavior pattern. 2 key points here is that mindset is the basis of the organizational culture, and if you want to change your organization's culture, you have to change mindset. Now don't worry, I'm not going to go off in some touchy-feely culture discussion where, we're going to have you sit down on the couch and tell me about your parents and, your life. Did you have a dog? It's not, the cool thing about culture is it's changing. It's becoming concrete, something we can work on because of neuroscience. Let's look at 2 mindsets. One I'd like to call a fixed mindset. That's based on a book by Carol Dweck. She uses that terminology. We derive a lot of our sense of security and confidence from certainty. We tend to seek it. So the Jeep driver, that water's 6 inches deep, kawabunga, you drive in, right? The way the adult brain functions, and I use the word adult there on purpose, the way the adult brain functions, we naturally strive to operate in this green zone of apparent certainty where things are, as expected, rational, calculable, logical, familiar, risk-free, and certain. Okay? So this is the candle problem with the thumbtacks out of the box. I can see my way to the goal. It feels good. Okay? This is implementation, right? This is inside our current knowledge threshold, and this is the comfort area. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of things need to be in that green zone. Maybe most things, I don't know. We've got some beams up here somewhere holding up the roof. Those are hypotheses, and I'd like those hypotheses to be confirmed. I'm going with green zone. Somewhere, some engineer is designing a bridge, and he's calculating it. You know what? I'd like that to be calculable. How about dinner tonight? Place to sleep? Safe trip home tomorrow? I think all of those things should be in the green zone. Why not? The problem arises when we try to make everything certain, which our brain leads us into. Here are 3 reasons why trying to make everything certain gets us into trouble. Number 1, we can only see partway down the path to a challenging goal. You can't see all the way down to those challenges. How will we make that car? How will we prevent screws from cross-threading? As we set out, we don't know exactly. So, we like to think that success looks like this. We establish our goal or target condition, and we work straight away to there. Actually, Dan, I have to say, I think the managers, you can almost feel sorry because we had an example from a Lithuanian shipyard where they were trying to weld panels without warping, and they did 20 experiments. 18 of the experiments failed, although each failed experiment teaches you something, right? And they achieved their goal. And we presented this case, and there was a manager in the audience who said, boy, if I have 18 of 20 experiments failing, I have to look for a new job, right? So in his mind, this is the expectation placed upon him. It's impossible. It's much more like this. Within this PDCA zone, you know, that's where the experimenting happens. By the way, let me little sidebar. The lean community likes to say senior management needs to step up. I'm not so sure about that. I think the middle managers are the important ones in the company. And if we say that lean is not working because the senior managers aren't stepping up, that means that we in the lean community don't need to change. I think we in the lean community need to reflect, and we need to change our approach. For example, we go through the world saying PDCA. Nobody else knows what that is, okay? We need to change our language, okay? And if you say to a manager PDCA or experiment or iterate, you scare the hell out of them. It's like, oh my God, my team's never going to reach the goal. They're just going to experiment. So what you say is, we have a goal with a date. We have a budget. We have quality parameters that we cannot go outside of. And within this box, the team can experiment, but only inside that box. And they're like, oh, okay. We talk about developing capability. Believe me, I did it too. I don't know what it's like in the UK or Denmark. We have a lot of people from Denmark here. But in the United States, if you say to a manager or a senior leader, develop capability, you're not talking their language. They're not interested in that. In the United States, after 3-4 years, the people are moving on. If you say develop capability, the manager's going, great, I'm going to spend all this time and energy developing people's capability, and then they're going to go to my competitor, right? People don't stay for 30 years for the gold watch anymore. So instead, we could say, we're going to make your people more able to achieve goals and meet challenges. We're going to align your teams. That's the policy deployment talk. That's managerial language. So I think the lean community needs to take a little bit of a look. I think, Dan, you were alluding to that toward the end of your talk, saying, you know, we're the ones who need to reflect about what we're doing. I don't think the content of what we're doing is wrong, but I think we're presenting it in an excited way that makes sense to us, but is not speaking the manager's language. I'll get off my soapbox now. Okay. Number two, why is trying to make everything certain a problem? Number two is the special capabilities of our brain get engaged when we don't know, right? So a colleague of mine, a friend of mine actually, Dr. Gerald Hütte at Heidelberg does functional MRI scans. And so here's a brain doing a routine activity that the person's done many times before. In this case, they put him in the MRI tube and show a video through the windshield of this person's normal daily commute to and from work. It's a trip you make 10 times a week, right? And you can see not much is happening here. And what the neuroscientists say is this brain is coasting on memory it already has, which uses less energy, which the brain is always trying to do. Wants to have that subconscious automatic routine because then it can power down a little bit. Then they take that very same person, they stick them back in the MRI machine, and they show a video through the windshield driving down a twisty, very unfamiliar road to that person, and the brain lights up. And what the neuroscientists say is this brain is actively engaged in wiring new circuits. That's the special capability we have as humans. So in the fall, the squirrels are gathering the nuts, right? And they do it the same way every year. Now, if Dave and I were out there gathering nuts the way the squirrels do, we'd go, well, this sucks. And next year, we'd get a tarp, right? And then the year after, we'd go, hey, we could shake the trees. And then, maybe 3 years, knowing Dave and me, 4 years, we'd go, boy, what if we planted all the nut trees in one place? The squirrels aren't doing that, right? But we have the ability to do that, but only if we get into this zone. And number 3, Dan talked about science. Another reason why trying to make everything certain is a problem is that we advance to new solutions and levels of performance through disproof. The scientists, the good scientists, know this. The person on the street does not. In other words, when things are other than your prediction, when things go differently than you expect, that's the way forward. That's where we learn new things. And of course, on the street, we think if you make a mistake or something you predicted to happen doesn't happen, that's a mistake. It's negative. Actually, that's how you learn. So if we have a hypothesis and it's confirmed, it strengthens your already existing way of thinking. The neuroscientists say it weaves a highway in your brain. In northern Michigan, we still have a few outhouses. Privies? Privies? Right? So when you go up north on the weekend and then it snows maybe 2 feet. It's beautiful, glistening snow. You look out the window in the morning, having your coffee, 2, 3 coffees. You put off going out there as long as you can, but sooner or later you have to go to the little house out there, right? Now, after the snow has fallen, what path do you take? Any path you want. But if it hasn't snowed again and you've gone for several days to the outhouse, what path are you always going to take? The same one, of course. And that's exactly what's happening in your brain. So that whenever something you think actually happens, you're laying down another track, another track, another track. The more you yell at the driver in front of you, the more you're going to yell at the drivers in front of you. I'm talking to myself now, sorry. So a refuted hypothesis is interesting because it reveals a knowledge threshold, right? The threshold of knowledge is the learning edge. To reach new levels of performance, a knowledge threshold has to be there. Learning, by definition, means I don't know, right? So 2 points about these knowledge thresholds. Number one, you have to acknowledge them to see them, and it's really hard. Those 2 lines weren't the same length. We know how Kanban works, but I don't know how your Kanban system is going to work. Let's roll up our sleeves, and we're going to have to figure it out. You have to acknowledge them, and number 2, how do you see further? Well, the way I'm accustomed to working is I'm going to come down here and join you, and Dave, would you get some coffee and donuts? Because we're going to have a nice long discussion with our feet up on the table about what's over the hill there. Any conjecture? Or there's another way. How do we find out what's over the hill? Go take a look, which is the experiment, which is actually doing the experiment, right? So we see further, not by conjecture and talking, but by experimenting. Now, we can send Dave ahead. Could be a truck, so Dave, would you run ahead, take a look there. We'll have the coffee and donuts back here. So there's a second mindset, which I like to call an adaptive mindset. I'm still looking for the better term. I heard one the other day, an advancing mindset, moving towards something. With this mindset, you're actually operating in 2 zones simultaneously. Yeah, we want a lot of things to be in the green zone, but we have this expanded comfort area where we are working on things that are uncertain, right? This is the yellow zone is the candle problem with the tacks in the box. We don't know at the outset how we're going to make it, right? This is where ingenuity, discovery, it's the learning zone happens, right? And what Toyota's trying to do, really, I don't even know if they know this consciously, okay? I'm not so sure. Essentially, through practice, you expand your people's comfort zone. You make them more comfortable working through unclear paths. So we had a manager in a workshop. They had designed a target condition of 3 operators, currently 5, and the target condition was 2 weeks in the future. After 45 minutes of trying, the manager said, this isn't going to work. Let's go back to where we had it. We know that works. It was 45 minutes. And it was just not a criticism of the manager. It's a criticism of us, saying, oh my gosh, after 45 minutes of spending time in the uncertainty zone, the brain is running on, it's lighting up, like in that MRI scan. It's using a lot more energy. 45 minutes is all he could take. And then he snapped back. So, rhetorical question. Which organization is more likely to execute successfully, adapt, innovate, meet challenges? Let's go in one more level, down to the neuron. How do you actually change or develop mindset and, by extension, your organization's culture? Well, psychology and brain research are perfectly clear. Mindset can be changed. Our thinking and skills are much more plastic than we thought. There is that joke, at 60 you can cross on red, at 65 you have to, but by and large you can keep on learning into a ripe old age. Here it is. Here's your organizational culture. We took a picture of it, brought it along. I will warn you again, engineer talking about the brain. So your brain is estimated to contain 80, I've heard 50, I've heard 80, I've heard 100 billion of these neurons. Who counts these things? Graduate students? Can you imagine losing count? So you've got 100 billion of these neurons, and they terminate in each one of them terminates in up to 10,000 of these synaptic gaps, okay? And the way it works, apparently, or current state of the knowledge, is that this is the receiving end, the dendrites, and the other neurons attach here. Essentially, it creates a network in your brain, right? And there's an electrical signal that travels down the neuron. The cell body determines, in part, whether or not to send it, based on your past experience. the electrical signal comes down here, and then it comes to the synaptic gap, which looks like this. Probably doesn't look like that. I don't know if you have a surgery channel in the UK. We have one in the United States, and if you accidentally hit the surgery channel, it's like, oh, whoa, quick, change the channel. It's not clean and neat like this, but there is this synaptic gap. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So here it's an electrical signal, and then it has to jump this gap. And to jump the gap, it becomes an electrochemical process. These are the neurotransmitters, and sometimes it jumps the gap, and sometimes it doesn't. So you have, let's say, 80 billion times 10,000 of these gaps in your brain. Another neuroscientist that we're familiar with says he shows this to school children, and they ask a question that adults don't ask, and he says it's a brilliant question. They look at this diagram, and they kind of go, well, that's stupid. Why don't you just connect it? Why don't you just solder that together, and what the heck is the gap there for? And he says it's the question, right? Why is the gap there? Why do we have so many of those? What are they for? So we can change, so we can learn new things. The way it happens is this: the more, both the strength of the connection, which is schematically depicted here, not real, schematically, both the strength of the connection and the number of connections, they can actually move, apparently, the number of connections and the strength of the connections increases with use. So if they look at a brain of someone who plays the violin professionally their whole life, the number of neurons that are associated with left fingers in their brain is way more than yours, way more than yours. And so partly it's the number of connections and partly it's the strength of the connection. So if it's a pattern that you haven't done before, yellow zone, the signal has a very difficult time jumping this gap, probably won't jump the gap unless there's a real energetic push. Takes a lot of energy to get across there. On the other hand, a trained synapse, one that you've used many times before, like the violinist's left finger neurons, related neurons, the energy flows easily. There's the habit. The one on the right-hand side is folding your arms the first time. This is folding your arms the second time. This is the green comfort zone. This is the yellow learning zone. High resistance, low resistance. This is implementing, just get her done. This is innovating. Anyone have children? So I do too. When are they grown up? Someone help me here. Anybody know? They say 28. It's kind of phenomenal. I have 22 and 23-year-olds. Why does it take humans so long? I mean, a dolphin is born underwater. It's a mammal, has to breathe at the surface, right? It's not going to work if the dolphin's mother says, and next week I'll teach you how to swim, right? You got to breathe up there. So the dolphin comes pre-wired with those synapses ready to go. Their genes determine that those synapses already flow, but they can't change that. That's kind of hardwired in. I think one of the reasons it takes 28 years for us to bake is that we have so many open synapses that we can learn anything we want. Again, there's that astonishing capability if we use it. So let's see here. Organizations are faced with a dilemma. Heck, mankind is faced with a dilemma. Our brain favors existing neural pathways. It's that comfort zone, the green zone. We naturally and reflexively prefer routine, familiar activity in the certainty zone because it uses existing neural circuits, one of these, or these, which require less energy. Our brain likes to focus on familiar patterns. But B, meeting challenges, improving and adapting means building new neural pathways in the learning area. It's impossible to remove uncertainty from the process of improvement, adaptation, and creation. I really don't know what's going to make your Kanban system work. Now I'm in the yellow zone, and my brain doesn't like to be there. It's much nicer if I say, I know how Kanban works, let's make a plan, an implementation plan, and carry it out. Now I'm back in the green zone, and I feel better. Not because I'm a bad person, because that's the way the wiring works. So if we want to meet challenges, it's impossible to remove uncertainty from the process. The way forward lies outside our current knowledge threshold, and pursuing it activates new neural circuits which initially consume more energy. So my message is we're screwed, and I hope you have a good conference the rest of the 2 days. Oh, you want it upbeat? Okay. So the question is, how do we get more comfortable and skillful in this zone of uncertainty when we know that our brain doesn't like to be there? Well, here's a solution to the dilemma. This is the Toyota Kata idea. we're postulating this. How can we be creative and effective in dynamic conditions if we tend to automatically apply old solutions to new situations? The trick is to develop well-worn mental circuits not for solutions, but for a means of developing solutions along unclear paths. You practice the Improvement Kata, which makes you good at developing solutions and gives you a level of comfort in that yellow zone. It's just like training in sports. Here's the 1968 Detroit Tigers. And as I said, we sometimes take Germans to the game because it's really kind of fun to watch them sit there and go. Within 15 minutes, they ask, how long does this game last? 3 hours, you know. So this game's going to last 3 hours, but they have a coach. Interesting. What can the coach teach them? Well, it would be really fatal if the coach said, okay, second inning, first pitch, I want the whole team to run over to right field and get ready to catch the ball, right? He doesn't know what's going to happen. Yet the coach is teaching the team something. What is the coach teaching the team? What is the only thing he can teach them? How to play. That's the best you can do. Because we don't know how the game is going to go. I don't know what your Kanban system is going to take to become functional. All I can teach you is a way to do that. That's what we found people doing at Toyota. People can handle uncertainty. People can work iteratively, adjust and adapt if they've practiced and mastered a way of doing that. That's what the Improvement Kata is. So here's the deal, and I'm pretty much complete here. The Improvement Kata gives you something to hang on to in the uncertainty zone. If people are accustomed to making a plan and carrying out that plan, right, you get a certain sense of self-efficacy from that. If you're going to take that away and say, you know what, we don't really know how it's going to go between here and there, if you take that away from people, you have to give them something else. You can't take that away and expect them to be comfortable. So essentially, I think what Toyota is doing is saying, we can't predict what the path will be. So we don't want you to hang on to the plan. Look, Toyota plans very carefully and in detail, but they have this odd ability to make a plan, but then view the plan as a hypothesis and continue to adjust along the way based on what they're learning. So what they say is, you can't get your confidence from the plan, so instead you're going to get your confidence, or self-efficacy is probably a better word, from practicing this routine that makes you good, more effective at navigating this territory. And the more you practice it, the more comfortable you get, the larger the challenges you can handle. That's essentially what they're trying to do. And I think that's what we can do as a society as a whole. So right now we have a problem in the States. We just had a political contest, and one politician stands up and says, here's the problem and here's the solution and this is what will happen. Politicians use the word will quite frequently, right? And once you learn this stuff that I'm showing you here, it's impossible to use the word will because we can't even see a minute into the future. However, the politician who's standing there saying, this is the solution to the problem, this is what will happen, and over here is a politician who says, well, we know where we want to go, but I don't know how we're going to get there. We're going to have to experiment and find our way. That one's going to get elected, right? Because he's appealing to your green zones, to my green zone. So it's interesting. So essentially, again, you're trying to expand people's comfort with that yellow zone, and that's the diagram that it showed. So one conclusion is becoming clear. We're not going to be successful by copying Toyota's solutions, all right? And I honestly think that every time I went over there, I think I detected a little bit of, why are you looking at our solutions? Why aren't you home working on your own problems and your own obstacles? Because they're going to be different than our obstacles. And I also don't know why these pictures from the 60s, the goofus guy who's copying always is the chubby guy, and the gallant fellow looks like John F. Kennedy. It's just kind of, I don't know. We got some images delivered to us. But essentially, instead of copying Toyota's solutions, we should be copying how Toyota develops solutions, which is really, as Dan pointed out, more of a universal, not Toyota-specific, science-based approach. My research now has very little to do with Toyota. It's more about how do you develop this way of thinking and acting in other organizations. And here's another conclusion, straight from neuroscience. If we only periodically conduct training events or only episodically work on improvement and the rest of the time it's business as usual, so these lines represent, say, work days, and you can see these red fields here represent where we consciously work on improvement or have an improvement event, but the rest of the time it's business as usual, You know what neuroscience is telling us now? What you're teaching is business as usual. That's what you're actually teaching. So what this means is that, again, for the lean community, and I consider myself a member of the lean community, for us to reflect, it means that if we want a lean revolution, we're going to have to take lean from being a staff-led, periodic, episodic activity to a middle management coached daily activity. Now don't worry, how many here are in the lean department or function? Don't worry, the manager needs a coach. There's plenty to do. But I would like to argue that the middle manager is our customer. And we don't need to wait for top management to get on board because they're busy. We can make the middle manager successful, and then they'll listen to us. So Toyota's change management secret, kind of interesting. Here's Toyota's change management secret. They make no distinction between daily management and change management. They're one and the same. Practicing the Improvement Kata is how they manage, or the pattern of the Improvement Kata. So, in conclusion, where do you and your team want to be next? What challenges are you trying to meet? And what is your kata for getting there? And I'd like to leave you with that question.